Oke, bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hello friends, how is your life going on? I hope that all of you are in a peak condition and having a great day. I guess all of you are staying at home, aren't you? Please don't go to anywhere, stay healthy and keep watching this video. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and leave your comment under the video. Well, here we are from the 7th group of course Cultural Understanding subject. We'll explain you all about our topic today with the title The Challenges of Intercultural Communication. My name is Isna Melia Agustin and I am here as the first speaker today. Would like to explain about our first point, that is about culture shocks. I am sure that all of you here are familiar with the word culture shocks, right? Okay, let's start from its definition. Culture shocks is a psychological term to describe the circumstances and feelings of a person dealing with different cultural environmental conditions. Well guys, have you ever have experience of culture shocks before? If yes, how was your feeling? Sad? Happy? Confused? Stressed? Or maybe you are feeling so great about that? Okay, if you are still confused about the definition of culture shocks, let me give you an example. I guess all of you here ever did a traveling or coming to some places which have a different culture with your own, right? Well, if you are feeling strange about the people activities, their habitual and how they communicate one another, and after that you feel homesick, you cannot have a good adaptation there, and you feel uncomfortable, it means that you got a culture shocks. So, that's what culture shocks is. Have you already understood, guys, about the definition of culture shocks? I hope yes. So, now let's continue to the second point, that is about the stages of culture shocks. What is the meaning of the stages of culture shocks? It means the step that will be passed by you along the culture shocks process. So, there are 5 stages or 5 steps of the culture shocks itself. First is honeymoon phase. This phase is when you have just arrived at the town and you are still feeling enjoy and still amazed with all the new things you see in that place. And also you are still feeling that the different culture is something interesting for you. And usually this phase only stands for several days since your first arrival to that place. And the second is crisis phase. So in this phase, you have already felt that different culture is something difficult to be adapted by you, and you feel the difficulties of having interaction or communication with the people there who have a different language with you, and you will also feel that their culture is really strange for you and unbelievable. The third point is adjustment phase. Well, if you are able to survive the crisis phase, the second, you will come into this phase, that is adjustment phase, where in this period you will start to understand the culture diversity and you try to learn about that culture. Yeah, it could be called that you are starting to receive their culture. And after that is integration phase. This phase is happening when you start to realize about the good and the bad side of the culture you learned and how you face it well. And also you will feel like you are comfortable with the culture and it is your new identity. Okay, and the last is re-entry shocks. It happens when you go back to your town and you feel like have a different point of view about the culture diversity, and usually you will have a new adaptation again in your own culture, even if it is your own culture. Well guys, those are the explanation about the stages of culture shocks, and next to the factors influencing culture shocks. Actually, these factors have a similar explanation with the previous point, the stages of culture shocks. Okay, directly to the first, that is cultural differences. It can be like the way they communicate one another, how they eat, how they greet other people, and how they react to strangers. And still there are other examples of cultural differences. Okay, and the second is individual differences. Well, it also have the similar explanation with the previous point. For the example, can be from their phase of or the structure of their face, which is very different with us. Yeah, it can be called as individual differences. And the last is adaptation problem. Well, if you have a difficulty of having adaptation in a new place, it can be big a problem for you and becoming the biggest factors that will make you feel the culture shocks. But don't worry guys, these culture shocks will not affect everyone to the same degree. Usually, people who have considerable experience living in diverse social settings will usually adapt much more quickly than someone who has little experience encountering other cultures. So, it doesn't mean that all of you here will feel the culture shocks. Maybe just several of you guys. Okay, next is about the symptoms and negative impacts of culture shocks. There are seven, there are eight, here. Here are the symptoms and also the negative impacts of culture shocks. Well, if you got the culture shocks, usually you will encounter these feelings, such as feeling sadness, frustrations, health anxiety, ailment, temperament change, sensitive, loss of identity, and loss confidence. Okay. And then the next is positive impacts of culture shocks. There is the negative, and of course, there is the positive one. You can get a deeper insight into the cultural diversity of other countries. That's the positive impacts. And also, by culture shocks, it can also increase your connection or your friends, of course, and it will give you greater training to cope with culture shocks. So if you come to other places with different culture with you, you will not feel the culture shocks as big as your first culture shocks. That's what I mean. Okay, friends, that's all my explanation about culture shocks. If you have some questions, just feel free to ask me. And for the next point, will be explained by my partner. She is Miss Anisaul Afidah and Mr. Muhammad Azwar Muhtar. For them, the time is valuable. Thank you, guys.
Okay, thank you, Melly. I will continue the explanation. It's about culture acculturation and stereotype. The definition of culture acculturation is a process in which an individual adopt, acquire, and adjust to a new cultural environment. When two cultures interact, it is very possible that acculturation will occur when a culture is exposed to a foreign culture. Through the interaction of communication between cultures, a foreign culture will be adopted by another culture without eliminating the cultural identity. Potential acculturation. It has a 4 point. The first is similarities between immigrant cultures and indigenous culture. The more similar the original culture of immigrants with the indigenous culture which become its new environment will facilitate and accelerate the acculturation. The more similar the culture is, a person who is initially in a cultural environment doesn't need much adjustment when he is in the second cultural environment. Because it doesn't need a lot of adjustment, this will make the cultural similarities accelerate and facilitate acculturation. And the second, age at the time of immigration. Age at the time of migration also determine how acculturation is created. In this case, when someone is still small and move a new place and grow there, he will automatically follow the culture in his new environment. Meanwhile, when someone moves to an adult, they will need time and adjustment for acculturation because he has brought the culture from which he came from. And the third, characteristic and personality. An environment with good characteristics such as being friendly and having a high tolerance will facilitate and accelerate acculturation. Unlike the case with a closed environment and obviously intolerant will be difficult for acculturation. Therefore, the characteristic and personality, the environment, and the immigrant are crucial for acculturation. And the fourth is knowledge of indigenous culture before migration. Knowledge of indigenous cultures before migration is very important for immigrants. When he learns about indigenous culture before migrating, he can learn about it first, so it will be easier for immigrants to later adjust to the culture of the native. Acculturation in the cultural communication. Intercultural communication is the key to acculturation, especially when someone, in this case immigrants, who incidentally have a different culture with their new environment. When someone, in this case an immigrant, who incidentally has a culture that is different from his new environment, certainly requires a series of process and also adjustment. Acculturation will be very difficult to happen when there is no good communication. But good communication and good feedback will facilitate acculturation. We next to the next topic, it's about stereotype. Stereotype is an overgeneralized belief about a particular category of people. It is an expectation that people might have about every person of a particular group. The type of expectation can vary. It can be, for example, an expectation about the group's personality, preference, or ability. A stereotype can assume either a positive or a negative form. The generalization that people with PhD degrees in astrophysics from MIT are good at mathematics is a positive generalization and probably pretty accurate. However, this characterization is referring to a quite small number of individuals who represent a specialist context. The assumption that all Asian students are hardworking, well-mannered, and intelligent is an example of positive stereotype that represents an overgeneralization of a large group of people. Classifying all people who dress in good fashion as a drug addicts is a negative stereotype. Acquiring stereotype. Stereotype can be acquired in the four steps. The first is start from home during childhood or parents, and the second from school, and the third from social organization and religious, and the fourth from mass media. Stereotypes and intercultural communication. Four ways in which stereotypes obstruct intercultural communication. For the first is stereotype act as a type of filter, means they only believe the information that is consistent with the individual already know. For example, for many years, women were stereotyped as a rather one-dimensional group, the weaker sex confined to the role of mother and home worker. Those labels keep women from advancing in the workplace even when more skilled than their male counterpart. And the second is stereotype makes the assumption that culture-specific information apply to all members of the cultural group. For example, national and ethnic stereotype project the same traits on all members of the culture. To say that every United States American is an individualist overlook the fact that some people in the United States prefer group activity. And the third stereotype also hampers successful intercultural communication. And the fourth stereotype are resistant to change. Stereotypes are usually learned early in life, tend to be repeated and reinforced through in-group interaction, and become more solidifying with the passage of time. Contact between in-group and out-group may only strengthen accurate perception. To avoiding stereotype, we have to begin in early life, that is when you are in childhood. Research has revealed that children who experience positive contact with other groups hold fewer negative stereotypes than children who haven't had the opportunity for such contact. So to avoiding stereotype, we must start from childhood, and in this childhood we have to get a positive contact.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my turn to explain to you briefly about prejudice and racism. Well, actually, it is very necessary when you learn intercultural understanding and cross-cultural understanding. Let's get started to prejudice by a definition itself. Psychology has defined prejudice as unjustified or incorrect attitude, and usually negative, towards an individual based solely on the individual's membership of a social group. Dictionary of Cambridge University states that prejudice is an unfair and unreasonable opinion or feeling, especially when formed without enough thought or knowledge. But however, we have to remember that prejudice in contrast with discrimination. For example, a person may hold prejudiced views toward a certain race or gender, etc. It is also kind of prejudice, ladies and gentlemen. There are causes of prejudice. The term prejudice means prejudgment. A person is prejudiced when he has formed an attitude toward a particular social group of people before having enough information on which to form a knowledgeable opinion. Prejudice is such a basic part of a person's complex so process that any one of many causes may be a factor, such as a person's appearance, unfamiliar social customs of others, or even the type of motor vehicle a person travels. As noted by Gordon Allport in his landmark book, The Nature of Prejudice, it is more likely that multiple causes of prejudice may be involved at the same time. In addition, prejudice exists not only at the personal individual level, but also the collective social level. Um, Also, we need to comprehend about expression of prejudice itself. Genuine unexpected prejudice is rarely directly expressed. Prejudice almost always makes it into expression through the filters of suppressions and justification. To the extent that suppressions and justification play a role in the expression of any given prejudice, the underlying prejudice will only be modestly correlated with the prejudices people are willing or able to report. The end result of justification and suppression process are the first, the public expressions of prejudice, which includes outright derogations, discrimination behavior, public displays, and paper and pencil misers or of prejudice. And the second one is experience prejudice, which includes the private acceptance and acceptability of negative evaluations of people based on disliked group memberships. Expressed and experienced prejudice or conceptualized as the result of the same perceived. As a summary, the expressions of prejudice and the prejudiced people integrate into their self-concept come from the same underlying genuine prejudice, filtered through the process of justification and superations. Reports of prejudice are not genuine prejudice. Because why? Because prejudice is so closely tied to important values. This discrepancies between experience and expressed prejudice can lead to guilt and shame. But how actually the way to avoid prejudice, ladies and gentlemen? There are several or exactly three ways to avoid prejudice that we need to comprehend. The first one is challenging your own business biases. The second one is increasing your social connections. And the last one is coping helpfully with prejudice. Since stigma or social stereotypes, prejudice, negative beliefs that you think are true about a person or a group of people, having prejudice can interacting with different races can actually lower your executive brain functionings. This is due to the idea that highly prejudiced individuals must exert much energy self-regulating the behaviors. The definition or the meaning about challenging your own biases is in order to combat your own biases, you first need to know what they are. In social psychology, they are tools used to assess implicit feelings and beliefs about different individuals. These are called implicit association tests. And increasing your social connections means diversity may also be a factor that contributes to an inability and ability to cope well with prejudice. If you are not exposed to different races, cultures, sexual orientation, and religions, you cannot fully accept the diversity that exists in the world. When we really get to know someone is when we stop judging and start listening and listening. And the last thing that we need to know on how we avoid prejudice is coping healthful with prejudice. Because sometimes when we feel threatened by a prejudice or discrimination, we can want to hide ourselves from the world so that no more harm can be done to us. Hiding and concealing your identity may be a self-protective measure, but also may increase stress and negative reactions to prejudice. Go on to the next topics. It is about racism. Let's start with definition in order to establish our great theoretical framework about racism itself. Based on Oxford Dictionary, racism may be defined as the hatred of one person by another or the belief that another person is less than human because of skin color, languages, customs, place of birth, or any factors that supposedly reveals the passive nature of the person. It has influenced wars severely, the information of nations and legal codes. And also on the other hand, sociology has defined also racism as doctrine that holds that the world's human population consists of various races that are the primary determinants of human traits and capacities. This doctrine typically regards one's own race as superior to other races. Intergroup hatred and discrimination generally accompanies racist doctrines. There are categories of racism that we need to comprehend. The first one is structural, institutional, and the third one is individual or interpersonal. Let's get on to the first categories of racism. Structural racism means that the interplay of policies, practices, and programs of differing institutions which leads to adverse outcomes and conditions for communities of color compared to white communities that occurs within the context of a racialist historical and cultural condition. It has a relation between racism and historical cultural condition, which is it is became as the tools to establish a racism context. And the second one of categorizes is institutional. Policies, practice, and prejudice that work to the benefit of white people and the demand of people of color, usually unintentionally or inadvertently, because racism is often so of as individual acts of bias, while discrimination is still very much a reality. Focusing on individual acts of racism can obscure the realities that create and maintain racial inequality more broadly. And then the last thing or the last categories of racism is individual or interpersonal itself, which mean here prejudgment, bias, stereotypes, or generalization about an individual or group based on race has impact of racism or individuals, white people, and people of color internalize privilege and oppressions. Individual racism can result in illegal discrimination. It is also necessary for us to measure how to countering racism. There are three principles to countering racism. The first one is promote respect for cultural, linguistics, and religious diversity. As we know that Indonesia is the easiest example for us to counter racism. We already have a lot of diversity spread out in our circle nation. It began from Sumatra to Papua, with a lot of languages also exist in our nation. Therefore, it is important to countering racism by respect the diversity and cultural, linguistics, religious diversity, to stay away from racism. The second one is challenge prejudice attitudes. Against racism, it is also need to talk about prejudice attitude. If we have a bad attitude, as we explained briefly at the first explanation just now, prejudice can decide us as the unrespect people to have a sociology or socialist context, which means here challenge prejudice attitudes. It's the right way to countering racism itself. And the last one is address racist and discriminatory behaviors with sanction. It is also necessary to have a great sanction in behavior, because why? Because normally people in racist can easily to address whether it is a concept of racism or not. It is also necessary to advise people who doing racism along the streets, for example, like noising kind of white skin or black skin, so that we can we can erase the behaviors racism in our region. That's all our explanation. Thank you so much for watching, and if you have any questions toward our topics for today, you can also add your questions on the comment box below. Thank you so much. Here we go.